It is the morning of August 1st, 1944, and somewhere in the Norman countryside, dust rises in great choking columns above a ribbon of road that has not seen traffic like this since the Roman legions. Tanks grind forward, half-tracks jostle for position, staff cars weave between columns of marching infantry, and at the centre of it all, standing in the open hatch of his command vehicle with a lacquered helmet catching the summer sun, is a man who has been waiting for this moment for the better part of a year. General George S. Patton, Jr. is finally in command of an army, and he has absolutely no intention of waiting for anyone. The question is, what happens when one of his own generals looks him in the eye and tells him to do exactly that? To understand why that moment matters, you have to understand what the summer of 1944 had already cost the Allied cause. The D-Day landings of June 6th had been a triumph of planning and courage, but the weeks that followed had been something considerably less heroic. The bocage country of Normandy, that ancient patchwork of sunken lanes and dense hedgerows, had turned the most powerful mechanized force in history into something resembling a slow-motion siege. Villages that should have fallen in hours were held for days. Divisions bled for fields measured in meters. By the end of July, the Allied advance had stalled so badly that senior commanders were beginning to whisper privately about the grim arithmetic of attrition. The war that was supposed to end by Christmas was beginning to feel like something else entirely. Then came Operation Cobra. On July 25th, 1944, American bombers carpeted the German lines near Saint-Lô with a weight of ordnance that shook the earth for miles around. The breakthrough, when it came, was real, a genuine rupture in the German defensive line, and into that rupture, like water finding a crack in a dam, poured the newly activated American Third Army under the command of General George Patton. Patton had been deliberately sidelined for months. His slapping of a shell-shocked soldier in Sicily the previous year had made him a political liability, and the Allied High Command had used that liability cunningly, keeping Patton visible enough in England that the Germans were convinced he would lead the main invasion force. Now, finally unleashed, he was in a position to do what he had always argued modern armoured warfare demanded: move. Move fast, move deep, don't stop to consolidate, don't wait for your flanks to catch up, and above all, don't give the enemy a moment to breathe, think, or reorganize. But armies are not racing cars. They are vast, living organisms with supply lines and communication networks and commanders who carry the weight of thousands of lives in every decision. And in the first days of August 1944, as Patton's armoured columns began their extraordinary dash across the French countryside, one of those commanders, Major General Wade Heislip, leading the 15th Corps, received intelligence that gave him serious pause. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The German forces to his south were not, as hoped, in full disintegration. There were reports of organized resistance, of reinforcements moving up, of a potential counterthrust that could catch the 15th Corps dangerously exposed. Hayslip was not a timid man. He had fought well, and he would fight well again. But he was a careful man, a professional soldier who understood that boldness without security could become catastrophe in a matter of hours. He sent word up the chain of command. The situation was uncertain. Perhaps they ought to slow the advance, consolidate their positions, wait for clearer orders before pushing further south and east. He put this to Patton directly. What Patton said in response has been recorded in various forms, filtered through the memories of staff officers who were present, through diaries written under canvas in the August heat, and through the accounts Patton himself committed to paper later. The language varies depending on the source. Patton was not a man who expressed himself mildly under any circumstances, and some of his more colourful phrases have been rendered in forms suitable for polite company. But the substance of his response was absolutely consistent across every account. He told Haislip to go, not to wait, not to consolidate, not to send further inquiries up the chain, to advance with every available unit, to move faster than the enemy could react, to drive south and east with everything the 15th Corps had, and to do it now, before the moment dissolved. "Press on," Patton reportedly said. In some accounts, the phrasing was rather more emphatic than that. The reasoning Patton offered in those moments was not mere bravado. It was a coherent philosophy of warfare that he had been developing for 2 decades, grounded in his study of cavalry tactics, his reading of military history from Caesar to Rommel, and his deep intuition about the psychology of armies under pressure. An army that is retreating is not simply moving backwards, it is disintegrating, losing the invisible sinew of confidence and cohesion that holds military units together. The moment to strike a retreating enemy is not when you are certain of your own security. It is precisely when both sides are uncertain, when the situation is fluid, when hesitation by the pursuer gives the pursued exactly the breathing room they need to reconstitute themselves. Patton understood something else too. He understood that speed was itself a form of protection. An armoured column moving at 30 miles per day was a considerably more difficult target than one sitting in a defensive posture waiting for orders. The enemy could not accurately shell what they could not reliably locate. The enemy could not counterattack what had already moved past them. Speed was not recklessness, or rather, in the right circumstances, a certain kind of recklessness was the most rational strategy available. There is also a human dimension to this story that deserves attention, because it speaks to something essential about the relationship between Patton and the men who served under him. Haislip was not rebuked or humiliated for raising his concerns. Patton had no patience for timidity, but he was not so foolish as to confuse prudence with cowardice. Haislip had done his job. He had assessed the situation, identified a potential threat, and escalated appropriately. Patton simply disagreed with the conclusion, and he said so with the kind of volcanic clarity that left no room for ambiguity. In the strange alchemy of military command, this was not a failure of the system, but a demonstration of it working precisely as intended. What followed over the next 2 weeks was one of the most extraordinary performances in the history of modern armoured warfare. The 15th Corps drove south to Argentan. Other elements of the Third Army wheeled east towards Le Mans, then north, then east again, in a great sweeping arc that threatened to encircle the entire German 7th Army. The Falaise pocket, that terrible killing ground where tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped, bombed, shelled, and ultimately forced into surrender or flight, was the direct consequence of Patton's refusal to wait. The numbers are staggering even by the vast arithmetic of the Second World War. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 40 and 50,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner in and around the Falaise pocket in August 1944. Many more were killed. The German forces that escaped did so without most of their heavy equipment, their artillery, their transport, the material sinew of an army. Several divisions that had been fighting cohesively in Normandy simply ceased to exist as coherent military formations. The road to Paris, which had seemed impossibly distant just weeks before, was suddenly, almost shockingly, open. It is worth pausing here to consider what might have happened had Heislip's counsel prevailed. Military counterfactuals are always uncertain. History does not run controlled experiments, but the logic is not difficult to trace. A pause to consolidate, to wait for clearer orders, to ensure that flanks were properly secured, would have given the German High Command time that they desperately needed and did not deserve. The forces retreating through the Falaise Gap would have had time to organise their withdrawal, to salvage more of their equipment, to establish new defensive lines further east. The liberation of France, instead of accelerating dramatically in August 1944, might have stretched into the autumn and beyond. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944. Patton's Third Army had been in existence for precisely 24 days. The legacy of that August fortnight extends well beyond the immediate military results. Patton's conduct of the breakout from Normandy became a case study in what American military theorists would later call operational maneuver. The idea that decisive results in war are achieved not by grinding down the enemy's forces in attritional combat, but by dislocating them, by moving so fast and so deep that their command structure collapses before their fighting units can respond. This concept, refined over the decades that followed, became the intellectual foundation for the air-land battle doctrine that shaped American military thinking through the Cold War and beyond. There is a certain irony in the fact that Patton himself did not live to see his methods canonized. He died in December 1945 from injuries sustained in a motor accident in occupied Germany, a peacetime casualty of the same restless impatience that had made him so formidable in war. He was 60 years old. His career had been defined by controversy, by brilliance, by a temperament that was simultaneously his greatest asset and his most significant liability. But on that dusty road in August 1944, when one of his own generals looked at the map and saw reasons to slow down, Patton saw something different. He saw a moment that would not come again. He saw an enemy that was not yet broken, but was breaking. And he understood with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had spent his entire adult life studying war that the time to strike a breaking enemy is before they have finished breaking. Press on. 2 words, 2 weeks, and an army that had spent months bleeding in the hedgerows was suddenly racing through France at a pace that would have seemed fantastical in the dark days of July. The generals who wait for certainty before they act are not wrong to be cautious. The generals who act before certainty arrives and happen to be right become legends. Patton pressed on, and the war in Western Europe was never quite the same again.